Moscow's calling. They want to know when Putin should phone in. The call came from Moscow, encrypted and logged at 3:47 in the morning Washington time. Steve Witkoff listened as his Russian counterpart walked him through the plan. Not a peace plan for Ukraine, but a strategy for selling it to the president. How to frame the territorial concessions, when Putin should call for maximum impact, which phrases would make Trump feel like the dealmaker, the statesman, the man who ended a war no one else could stop. The conversation lasted 23 minutes, and when it ended, Witkoff had become something more complicated than a mediator. He'd crossed a line that diplomats aren't supposed to cross, offering advice to one side on how to manipulate the other, coaching a foreign power on the psychology of the American president. 2 months later, those recordings would leak to Bloomberg and the Washington Post, and the firestorm would begin. But by then he'd already be on a plane to Moscow, carrying a revised plan that satisfied no one, tasked with convincing Vladimir Putin to accept changes that erased everything Russia had demanded in the first place. And the question would hang in the air, unanswered and unanswerable: can you broker peace when you've already chosen a side? Witkoff had never been a traditional diplomat. He was a real estate developer from the Bronx who made billions buying and selling Manhattan landmarks, the Woolworth Building, the Daily News Tower, properties that carried weight in history. The president trusted him because they spoke the same language, the language of deals and leverage, and knowing when to walk away from the table. When Trump needed someone to handle the impossible, broker Middle East agreements, negotiate hostage releases, and a European war that had killed hundreds of thousands, he turned to Witkoff, not because of diplomatic credentials or foreign policy expertise, but because Witkoff understood something career diplomats often didn't, that at the end of the day, every negotiation came down to what people wanted and what they feared losing. Putin wanted legitimacy for his territorial conquest. Zelensky wanted survival. Trump wanted the Nobel Prize and a legacy that erased the chaos of his first term. If you understood those core desires, you could build a deal, or so Witkoff thought before the phone calls leaked and everything became exponentially more complicated. The October conversations had been routine in Witkoff's mind, just part of the back-channel work that made diplomacy function. He'd spoken with Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's economic envoy and the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, dozens of times over the months of negotiations. They'd built a rapport, the kind of working relationship that let them speak frankly without the stilted language of official communiques. In one call, Dmitriev had asked about timing. When should Putin reach out to Trump directly? What framing would be most effective? Witkoff had answered honestly, offering insight into the president's schedule, his mood, the moments when he'd be most receptive to a bold proposal. It had felt collaborative, two professionals trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Only later, when the transcripts appeared in news reports, did Witkoff understand how it looked from the outside, like an American envoy helping Russia game the system, coaching a foreign adversary on how to manipulate his own president. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Republican lawmakers who had been skeptical of the peace process now called for Witkoff's resignation. He was compromised, they said, too close to Russian interests, a man who'd forgotten which country he represented. Democrats who'd been opposing Trump's Ukraine policy from the start seized on the revelations as proof of what they'd been warning about, that the administration was more interested in appeasing Moscow than defending Kyiv. Cable news ran segments with former diplomats explaining the concept of neutrality, the sacred principle that mediators couldn't favor one party over another without destroying the integrity of the entire process. Op-eds appeared in the New York Times and Washington Post questioning whether Witkoff had the judgment or the ethics to continue in his role. And in Ukraine, where every word from Washington was parsed for signs of betrayal, the leak calls confirmed the darkest fears that America's peace broker was working for the other side. Witkoff tried to defend himself, issuing a statement through the White House press office that called the characterization of the calls misleading and insisted his conversations with Dmitriev were part of standard diplomatic practice. The president backed him publicly, dismissing the controversy as another example of the media trying to sabotage peace efforts. "Steve's a deal maker," Trump told reporters on the South Lawn. "That's what deal makers do. They talk to both sides, they find common ground. People who've never closed a deal in their lives don't understand how this works." But the defense rang hollow to critics who pointed out that deal-making was fundamentally different from diplomacy, that treating a war as a real estate transaction reduced human suffering to negotiating points, that the lives lost and futures destroyed deserved something more sacred than the transactional logic of business. The leaked calls also revealed something else, something that troubled even those who'd been supportive of the peace process, the extent to which Russia had shaped the original 28-point plan. Dmitriev's conversations with Witkoff showed him essentially dictating terms, territorial concessions that went beyond what Russian forces had actually captured, military restrictions that would leave Ukraine defenseless, NATO prohibitions that would cement permanent vulnerability. And Witkoff had incorporated those demands almost verbatim into the initial draft, the one that had been presented to Zelensky as an American proposal. It wasn't collaboration between honest brokers trying to find middle ground. It was one side writing the other side's homework, then calling it compromise. When the plan leaked in late November, Ukraine's reaction had been swift and angry. Zelensky called it unacceptable, a document that asked victims to legitimize their own destruction. His advisors were more blunt, using words like surrender and betrayal in briefings with European allies. The Ukrainian parliament passed a resolution rejecting any agreement that ceded territory or restricted sovereignty. Protests erupted in Kyiv, thousands gathering in Independence Square to demand that their government refuse the American ultimatum. And then the president had delivered his deadline: accept the plan by Thanksgiving or risk losing U.S. support. It was the kind of pressure that felt less like diplomacy and more like extortion: sign away your future or we'll leave you to die. But something had shifted between the leaked draft and Witkoff's current mission to Moscow. The backlash had been too fierce, the European response too unified, the domestic politics too toxic. The administration had been forced to revise, bringing Ukrainian negotiators to Geneva for marathon sessions that produced what officials carefully called an updated framework. The specifics remained classified, but leaks suggested significant changes. Territory would be negotiated rather than simply handed over, military restrictions would be loosened, and the NATO question would be deferred rather than permanently closed. Russia's maximalist demands, the ones Dmitriev had dictated to Witkoff in October, had been watered down or eliminated entirely, which meant Witkoff was now flying to Moscow to ask Putin to accept a deal that gave him far less than what had been promised. It was a diplomatic nightmare, made worse by the fact that everyone knew Witkoff had been the one doing the promising. The plane touched down at Vnukovo Airport on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of Moscow winter where the sun never quite breaks through and everything exists in perpetual twilight. Witkoff descended the steps flanked by State Department security, their presence a reminder that even routine diplomatic visits carried risks these days. Waiting on the tarmac was Dmitriev, the same man Witkoff had spoken with in those October calls, now greeting him with a warmth that felt performative for the cameras. They shook hands while photographers captured the moment, two men whose private conversations had become public scandal now playing their roles for an audience that stretched from Washington to Kyiv to Moscow and beyond. The drive to the Kremlin took them through streets that looked almost normal if you didn't know what to look for: the occasional military convoy, propaganda billboards celebrating Russian strength. The absence of certain faces that used to populate cafes and bookstores before the war made descent too dangerous. Witkoff had been to Moscow twice before during the negotiations, but this trip felt different. The leaked calls had stripped away any pretense of neutrality. Everyone understood now that he wasn't an honest broker. He was Trump's man pursuing Trump's agenda, and if that agenda happened to align with Russian interests in some uncomfortable ways, well, that was just the price of getting deals done. Putin kept him waiting. Not long, just 45 minutes. Enough to establish hierarchy without being overtly insulting. When Witkoff was finally ushered into the presidential office, he found Putin seated behind an absurdly large desk flanked by Dmitriev and Yuri Yoshikov, another key foreign policy aide. The room was designed to intimidate: all high ceilings and historical paintings, and the subtle suggestion that you were a visitor in someone else's empire. Witkoff had dealt with power players his whole career, had negotiated with men who thought they owned cities. But this was different. Putin wasn't trying to close a deal. Putin was trying to win a war, and he had time and leverage that Witkoff didn't. The Russian president opened with pleasantries, thanking Witkoff for making the trip, praising the constructive dialogue that had brought them this far. Then he got to the point: the revised American plan was significantly different from what had been discussed in Alaska when Putin and Trump had met face to face and established what Moscow considered the foundational principles of any agreement. If those principles were being abandoned, Putin said carefully, then Russia would need to reevaluate its participation in the process. It was diplomat speak for a threat: give us what we want or we walk away, and the war continues and you'll be the one who failed to stop it. Witkoff tried to thread the needle, explaining that the changes were necessary to secure European buy-in and Ukrainian acceptance, that a deal both sides rejected was no deal at all. He emphasized the elements that remained favorable to Moscow: territorial gains that would be internationally recognized, security guarantees that limited Ukraine's future, military posture, economic reconstruction packages that would benefit Russian companies. But Putin wasn't buying it. The core concessions he demanded: full control of Donbass and Crimea without qualification, permanent NATO exclusion, military caps that would leave Ukraine unable to resist future aggression, those had all been softened or removed. Why? Putin asked with a slight smile, should Russia accept less now, when its military position on the ground had only improved? Time was on Moscow's side. Trump would be out of office eventually. European resolve would crack under the weight of energy costs and refugee flows. Ukraine was exhausted, bleeding, running out of ammunition, and soldiers in hope. From Putin's perspective, accepting a compromise deal now meant giving up the total victory that might be achievable if he just waited. The meeting lasted 3 hours and produced exactly what everyone expected: vague statements about continued dialogue and progress on several key points that translated to nothing concrete. Witkoff emerged to face a press gaggle asking pointed questions about the leaked calls, about whether Putin had expressed any willingness to compromise, about how he could possibly claim to be neutral after coaching the Kremlin on manipulation tactics. He deflected with practiced ease, insisting that the conversations had been mischaracterized, that anyone who understood diplomacy knew back-channel communication was essential, that the alternative to messy negotiations was continued war. But his answers lacked conviction, the kind of defensive posture that signaled he knew the ground had shifted beneath him. That night, while Witkoff tried to sleep in a hotel room that was certainly bugged, Russian missiles fell on Kyiv. 7 people died, a grandmother shielding her granddaughter in a basement that took a direct hit, a young couple who'd survived 3 years of war, only to die in an attack that came while peace talks were supposedly progressing, a medical worker who'd been treating casualties and became one. The strikes hit civilian infrastructure, knocking out power and heating in temperatures that were already dropping below freezing. It was Moscow's way of negotiating kill innocents while your diplomats smile and talk about compromise, remind everyone that Russia holds the power to inflict suffering whenever it chooses. And the timing felt deliberate, a message to Witkoff and Trump and anyone watching: you can revise your plans all you want, but we'll keep killing until we get what we demand. Ukrainian social media exploded with rage. Zelensky's team released a statement condemning the barbaric attack on peaceful citizens and pointedly noting that it came as American envoys meet with those responsible for these war crimes. The implication was clear: by sitting down with Putin while bombs fell on Kyiv, Witkoff was legitimizing terror, treating mass murder as a negotiating tactic rather than the moral obscenity it was. Protesters gathered in Independence Square again, this time carrying signs in English meant for American audiences: your envoy works for them, and peace with dignity or no peace at all. Back in Washington, the political calculations were growing more complex. Trump had invested significant political capital in the peace process, holding it up as proof that only he could solve problems others couldn't. But the leaked calls and the ongoing violence and the lack of concrete progress were making the whole effort look less like statecraft and more like a slow-motion disaster. Republican senators who'd been supportive were now hedging, demanding more transparency about what exactly was being negotiated. Democrats were preparing congressional hearings on Witkoff's fitness for the role, subpoenaing State Department documents that might reveal the extent of coordination between the administration and Moscow, and European allies who'd been skeptical from the start were openly discussing contingency plans for a scenario where American leadership simply couldn't be trusted. The real problem, the one that nobody wanted to say out loud, was that the peace process had been built on a fundamental lie that there was a deal both Ukraine and Russia could accept that wouldn't simply be a pause before the next round of violence. Putin wanted Ukrainian territory, military submission, and permanent exclusion from Western alliances. Ukraine wanted sovereignty, security, and the right to determine its own future. These positions weren't just far apart, they were existentially incompatible. One side was demanding the right to conquer, the other was demanding the right to exist. No amount of diplomatic creativity could bridge that gap. No clever framing could disguise the fact that any agreement would require Ukraine to trade survival for time, hoping that the ceasefire would hold long enough for them to rebuild and rearm and prepare for the inevitable next war. Witkoff understood this, even if he couldn't admit it publicly. In quieter moments, talking with State Department officials over encrypted channels, he'd acknowledged that the best they could hope for was a frozen conflict, a ceasefire that left fundamental questions unresolved, bought time for diplomacy that might never come, and gave both sides a face-saving way to stop the immediate bloodshed without resolving the underlying cause. It wasn't peace, it was an armed truce that could collapse whenever Putin decided he was ready for another go. But it would stop the dying at least temporarily, and in a war this brutal that had to count for something. The question was whether anyone would accept it. Ukraine had already indicated the revised plan was closer to their red lines, but still not there. Russia was clearly unhappy with the changes from the October version. European allies wanted more robust security guarantees that Washington couldn't or wouldn't provide, and Trump himself was growing impatient, frustrated by the endless negotiations and the lack of the easy win he'd been promised. He'd gone from setting hard deadlines to abandoning them entirely, from threatening to walk away to insisting everything was moving in the right direction, even when it clearly wasn't. The rhetoric kept shifting because the reality kept refusing to cooperate with the narrative. 5 days after Witkoff's Moscow trip, Jared Kushner quietly joined the process. The president's son-in-law, who'd stayed out of the Ukraine negotiations while focusing on Middle East diplomacy, was now being deployed to Moscow for another round of talks with Putin. The official line was that Kushner's experience brokering the Abraham Accords and other deals made him a valuable addition to the team. The unofficial reality was that Trump was running out of people he trusted, and Kushner was family. If Witkoff couldn't close the deal, maybe the family connection could. It was the kind of personnel decision that raised eyebrows among professional diplomats who understood that family loyalty wasn't a substitute for strategic coherence. But by this point, the administration was improvising, throwing different personalities at an intractable problem and hoping something would stick. Kushner's first meeting with Putin lasted 6 hours and produced more of the same: warm words, vague commitments, no concrete progress on the actual sticking points. The Russian president seemed to enjoy the revolving door of American negotiators, each one arriving with a slightly different pitch, each one discovering that Moscow's fundamental position hadn't changed. Give us what we want, or we keep fighting. Simple, brutal, effective. Time was Russia's ally. Every month, the war continued, weakened Ukraine economically and militarily, tested European resolve, divided American politics. Putin didn't need a deal. He needed the other side to blink first. Meanwhile, the leaked calls continued to haunt Witkoff. New details emerged, not just the October conversations, but others from September and November, painting a picture of an envoy who'd become far too comfortable with Russian officials, who'd shared intelligence assessments and diplomatic strategies and insights into American thinking that should have remained confidential. One particularly damaging revelation showed Witkoff advising Dmitriev on how to undermine Ukrainian President Zelensky's credibility with European leaders, suggesting talking points that would portray the Ukrainian position as unreasonable and maximalist. It was one thing to maintain cordial relations with your negotiating partners. It was something else entirely to actively help them sabotage the other party. Congressional hearings began in early December, with Witkoff testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about his role in the negotiations. The questioning was brutal, with senators from both parties demanding explanations for specific conversations, specific pieces of advice given to Russian officials, specific moments when he seemed to be working for Moscow rather than Washington. Witkoff defended himself with the same arguments he'd been making for weeks: that back-channel communication required trust, that building rapport meant sharing some information, that the alternative was rigid diplomacy that never produced results. But his answers felt increasingly hollow as more evidence accumulated that he hadn't just built rapport, he'd become an advocate for Russian positions, a man who'd lost sight of which side he was supposed to represent. The president continued to back him, but the support felt more obligatory than enthusiastic. Trump needed Witkoff to succeed because failure would mean admitting the entire peace process was flawed, that his instinct to negotiate directly with Putin had been a mistake, that the experts who'd warned against trusting Moscow were right all along. So he kept insisting everything was fine, that progress was being made, that peace was just around the corner even as the evidence suggested otherwise. It was the same pattern that had defined so much of his presidency, reality becoming whatever he declared it to be, facts mattering less than the narrative he wanted to tell. By mid-December, 3 months after those leaked October calls, the situation had calcified into a familiar stalemate. Russia insisted on terms Ukraine couldn't accept. Ukraine demanded security guarantees America couldn't provide. European allies offered support without the military commitment that would make it meaningful. And Witkoff, the compromise mediator at the center of it all, kept flying between capitals, holding meetings that produced statements that meant nothing, trying to salvage a process that had been tainted from the moment those first conversations with Dmitriev crossed the line from diplomacy to collaboration. In Kyiv, families huddled in bomb shelters during the nightly missile strikes that never really stopped, wondering when the Americans would understand that survival couldn't be negotiated, that sovereignty wasn't a bargaining chip, that some things were worth dying for because the alternative was worse. In Moscow, Putin watched and waited, confident that time and terror would deliver everything he wanted without the need for messy compromises. In Washington, politicians calculated and positioned, trying to figure out which side of the peace process would benefit them in the midterms, whether supporting negotiations made them look statesmanlike or naive. And somewhere over the Atlantic, on yet another overnight flight to yet another meeting that wouldn't solve anything, Steve Witkoff stared out at the darkness and wondered when exactly he'd stop being a mediator and become something else. When had the desire to broker peace transformed into the willingness to do whatever it took, even if that meant betraying the principles that made peace worth having? The leaked calls had shown the world what he'd been willing to do, but they couldn't show what he'd been thinking, the rationalizations that had made it all seem reasonable in the moment, the gradual corruption of purpose that happened so slowly you didn't notice until someone played back the recordings and forced you to hear yourself. The question haunted him, can you broker peace when you've already chosen a side? And the answer, which he'd never say out loud, but which hung in the silence of that transcontinental flight, was probably not. Probably you just become another player in the game, advancing interests that aren't the ones you were sent to serve, telling yourself it's all in service of the larger goal, even as the larger goal slips further away. Probably you just become proof that good intentions and moral compromise can coexist longer than anyone wants to admit, that the road to peace can be paved with betrayals too subtle to notice until someone publishes the transcripts and the whole world sees what you were willing to do. Below him, somewhere in the darkness, people were dying in a war he'd promised to help end, and above him, recorded and logged and waiting to leak, or probably more conversations, more moments where he'd crossed lines he didn't realize were there until it was too late. The plane droned on through the night, carrying a compromised envoy toward a destination that kept proceeding no matter how many miles he traveled. Peace, it turned out, was always just over the horizon, and the leaked calls had shown everyone exactly why.